So the next part of our lesson here is going to be on merging our meshes and a little bit of animating. So some of the extra credit for this one, if you want to do it, is animating. Of course, you don't have to animate in the way that I'm showing you now. You can do other types of animation for the extra credit, but I thought this might be a cool way to show you another way that you can animate your meshes, either from your sculpt directly or after you've sculpted, or even with your mesh parts as well. So what we're going to be getting into to start here is the volume builder. So I think I've mentioned this a couple of times before, but now we'll get into it in a little bit more detail. So what I'm going to do for this one here is, can I use this one? Yeah, I could use this as is. Actually, let's see. I'm going to switch my layout back to my standard layout here, just so I can set this up here. I'll close this one. I don't believe I need that scene. We'll hide all of this, and we'll just make a new one. So I think I'm going to start with, we'll start with a capsule, just so we can try a different object. Make sure to save my scene just to save it. Actually, I'll increment and save just to save a new file. So the idea of a volume builder is it allows you to connect different elements to whatever you want to, without having to go through sort of the manual labor of modeling, pulling points, sculpting. This is more of a way to sort of connect things in a more procedural way. So there is some, manual labor to it, I guess you could say, but a lot of it is done sort of, automatically through the computer's interpolation of points in your scene. Now, to do this, you don't actually have to make your objects editable. Of course, if you're doing some sculpting and stuff like that, your objects will already be editable, but you can add items that aren't broken apart or baked when you're doing sort of the volume builder meshing. So to start off here, I just have my capsule here, and let's say I want to add maybe some, I don't know, let's say I want to add a rectangle to this object, and I can make sure my object is selected here. I could maybe size this down a bit. I don't know, maybe I wanted to have, maybe I want it to look a little bit like it has some wings or something like that. So maybe that's sort of idea that I'm going for here. So right now we have these two objects that are completely independent of each other. If I look at the lines here, I can see that one cuts through the other, and there's nothing here that really shows that these are one sort of integrated piece of overall geometry. If I wanted to connect these together, what I could do is I could come up here to my volume builder icon. So up here, this is the volume builder, and if I left click and hold on it, I can bring up an icon that actually shows I have the volume builder and the volume mesher. Both of these are what we're going to be using right now in order to connect our objects together. If I wanted to find these in the menus, they would be up here at the top underneath volume. So volume builder, volume mesher. So the first thing, if I just click this, it's going to add a volume builder in my scene. And what I need to do is any of the objects that I want to combine together, I need to drag them all below the builder object. So I can shift select both of these, I could control select both of these, I could drag them one by one, and drag them on top of the volume builder and make sure that the down arrow is there, and then they're going to come below it. So now you're going to see this sort of weird interpolation of our scene, of our objects here, and this is showing that they're actually connected together. Now, this is an actual geometry, so if I were to render my scene right now, I'll see nothing. What I need to do in order to see something in my scene is I need to bring in my volume mesher, and as the name might imply, it meshes or creates a mesh for our object. So if I add this into my scene, nothing by default, it does anything. But if I select the builder, left click and hold on top of it, and drag it on top of the mesher, make sure that the down arrow is there, and release it. Now you'll see that I have new geometry in our scene, and it's actually merging together the two objects that I have. Usually this is the default application or default way that it does it. There are other methods that it might do by default, but believe this is the default one. So right now we can already see, and if I render this, this looks like one sort of complete object here rather than two separate pieces that are connecting together. Now that we have this like this, there are some settings we can adjust if we want this to be more precise and less loose. On the volume builder itself, there are a number of different options that we can choose in the attributes. The first one to bring notice to you is the voxel size. This is essentially 3D pixels, and it determines the accuracy of the meshing. So if I were to go down to say 3, you can now see that now the sort of indent here on the cut is a lot sort of precise than what it was before. And you can go down as far as you want to. Just keep in mind that this does use your system memory and processing power. So you can see down here below the update button, there's an icon that says, or a text that says the size of the memory that it's actually using right now. So just keep in mind that if you go down too low, it might be too much for your system to handle. So save and save often when you're using this process. So below the voxel size here is where your actual objects are in the scene, and right now the cube is being combined, so it's under the union right now. And if I click this drop down, I can see that there are other options I can choose. There's subtract and intersect. So if I choose subtract and look through, now I can see that I have a hole cut out between my capsule here. Or if I choose intersect, now it just shows the inner part of the capsule and the cube that intersect with each other. So you can play around with this and create some cool, interesting shapes without having to do a lot of crazy modeling. Some things that you might want to keep in mind though is the overall shape of your object. So if you notice right now, it looks kind of faceted on the edges. So there's a couple different things you could try to sort of remedy this. You could try to increase the smoothing on the object that it's applied to. So the spheres or the parametric objects, you have sort of the segments that you can increase in order to add more accuracy to that. So we can add that in the caps to make it a bit smaller. We can add that to the segments on the side and maybe make that a bit smoother. So that's some things that you could do. You also, if you didn't notice, there's something here called smooth. So you can actually add this into your lineup here, and that's going to do basically sort of a big blur over everything. Now, you can see here that that blur was way too strong for what I think it should be. So you can sort of adjust these numbers, maybe the voxel distance, maybe even the strength, to sort of, get this smoothing to the sort of shape that you actually like. So of course you could imagine that maybe you're doing eyes for your emoji and you want the eyes to actually look like they're coming from your object, or maybe you're doing a mouth and you want the mouth to actually look like it's coming from the object, or maybe you just want to cut out the hole for the mouth. This might be one way to do that. Now, if you are doing this and you do want to do painting and sculpting, you might notice that sometimes your materials do get disappeared. And that's because materials that you apply below the object do get overridden, because essentially you're creating a new geometry, new mesh for this. So the only materials that are going to show up if you're using the volume mesher are going to be the ones that are on top of the volume mesh. So if you have individual materials for the items below it, you'll notice that those aren't being shown. So you would have to sort of reapply your materials, or if you're using the paint method, apply them after the fact. Now there are some sort of things you can do to get around this. You could have multiple volume meshers and have one for one part and one for the other part and do it that way. But, there are, drawbacks and, sort of positives depending on any sort of method you use inside of the 3D programs in general. Now, let's say we're happy with this mesh here. If we wanted to make this editable, like let's say we like this mesh perfectly as is, and we wanted to make it editable, we can of course hit C, and that'll break it out into geometry, or come up to the top left and hit make editable. Now, whenever I do this, I always like to make backups of things, so I always just control drag everything just to make a backup of it, just in case, I want to come back to it later on. But now I have my new mesh here, and I can see that it looks, pretty cool. I could maybe add a subdiv on top of it if I wanted to make it even smoother than it already is. But now that I have this, volume mesh object that I created, I could, sculpt on this. I could paint on this. So, let's say I wanted to sculpt this a little bit more. I could, switch to my sculpting layout, subdivide this, and maybe I just want to mess with this as is. I don't even want to add another level of density to it. So I could come over here, maybe make an eye there, maybe make an eye there, maybe make a nose there, and maybe make a mouth over here. So now I got this sort of weird face on my sort of new emoji character here. And then once I'm happy with this, maybe I could even paint on this as well. So again, if I wanted to paint on this, I would probably bake this out again. So I could right click and go current state the object, hide my original one, and then I could go through the whole body paint exercise and sort of lay out the UVs, or go through the paint wizard and paint the individual parts that I want to. So you can do a lot with this this sort of method here, and that's a really quick way that I've just created this simple face with some merged geometry. You can imagine that these could be ears of your character, they could be wings of your character, it could be anything that you really want it to be. It's really up to you how you want your character to actually look. But that's really quickly there just how you can mess with the volume builder to create this sort of customized mesh here. And again, the process that we went through this is I made sure to have multiple objects in my scene. So let's say this time I want to have multiple pieces of my sort of cube here. So maybe I want one cube there, I want to add another cube here, maybe another cube down here. Turn on the volume builder and turn on the volume mesher and see how this looks. Now you'll notice that because I added those new cubes after my smooth, the smooth is actually below them. So if I wanted the cubes to be in the smooth, I would rearrange the order down here and make sure that the smooth is on top here. So now I have all my items together here. And again, let's say I like this as is. I could make a backup of this because I'm paranoid of losing stuff. Now on my volume mesher, I could hit the make editable button, and now I have another object here that I can draw on top of this one as is, even without the sculpt tool on it. I just don't have the control that I might want for doing some other things later on. But I could come over here and make another face all over again if I really wanted to, just using this sort of base mesh as is. But what I do want to show you, now that we've gotten to this point here, is I wanted to show you how you can use the sculpt tool to actually create some animations inside of Cinema 4D. Now there are a couple different ways that you can go about doing this. The way that I sort of thought of this originally was actually more of a sort of manual method of doing this, but there is actually even a better way of doing this. but I'll show you the sort of, slower way first, just so you can see what it is, and then you can sort of take and pick which way works better for you. But staying in the sculpting layout right here, and I don't have a sculpting tag on my volume mesher, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this, I don't know, 6-arm bug, maybe. And I'm going to make this the base. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this just so I have a new version of this, and I'm going to hide my original one. And this one, I'm just going to name this one B1. And this is just so I know what I'm doing. And then now you can do this using any tool. Right now, I just happen to still be in the sculpting layout, but you could do this by, selecting the polygon points directly if that works better for you. Just sort of selecting points around like that. But I think because I'm in the body, in the sculpting layout rather, I'm just going to use the grab tool, and I'm actually going to come in here, size this down, and I'm just going to sort of try to move stuff around. Now I'm working on my second one here. So keep in mind that I'm not working on my original base here. I'm working on my second sort of one here. So I'm not going, I'm not doing anything specific here. I'm just sort of want to move these around so you can see what actually happens. So right now I have 2 different poses of my bug arm. I have ones with them being straight and one with them being sort of manipulated here. And what I'm actually going to do is on my base, I'm actually going to right click on it, and I want to go to, where is it? Rigging tags? Yes, rigging tags. And I want to enable, or I want to add onto it a pose morph. So I'll zoom in here. So what I want to add onto it is the pose morph. And if you don't have the right click, you can go to tags and find it over here just as well. So this is under rigging tags. It's all the way down here. Now, what we're going to use this is enable to create sort of animations on our base model here. So I can actually hide my original B1 bug here. And down here in the properties for the pose morph, I want to enable some things in order to actually control them later on. So what I'm going to enable is called points. And the reason why we're enabling points is because what we use the grab tool to move around is the actual points of our geometry. You can see that there are other options here, such as position, scale, rotation, parameters. So there are other options that you can use this with, but we're just going to mess with points. So I'm going to enable this. And then right now we have our base pose, which is what is currently on. And then below that we have pose 1. And now what we're going to do is we actually want to add a target here. And the target is going to be the other mesh that we manipulated. So in our case, that's going to be the 6-arm bug B1. So the 6-arm bug B1 is the one that I'm going to click and hold on. I'm not going to release, because if I release, it's going to come up in the properties here. I'm going to hold this, and I'm actually going to drag this to the target. And you'll see that automatically our base mesh here moves into its new position. And that's because now we have the ability to control the strength of movement on this sort of pose here. So this is actually going to be a new pose that we can actually keyframe and move around however we like. So what you can do now is you don't have to stay in this little layout here. This is the edit mode. There's a mode here called animate. And if we switch into this, now we have this slider here, and this slider for pose 1, which you can rename this so you actually know what you're doing. This will actually allow us to, adjust our pose here. So if I wanted to, create an animation here, I'll switch my layout real quick to startup layout. Double tap the pose here. So if I frame 1, I want this to be at this pose, and then at frame 30, I want it to be at my new pose. I could come over here, create another keyframe, and now we'll set our timeline to 30 here. Now it looks like I didn't actually set my first keyframe to 0, so I'm going to make sure to set that to 0. Oh, so that's funny. So I actually adjusted not the keyframe for the slider, I adjusted the keyframe for the enable. So make sure you have the right thing selected when you're making your keyframes. So right that, now we have a little bit of animation on our pose morph. Now this, took a couple steps to do this, but you can see that, if you wanted to create, a face that smiles, or a face that's sad, or a face that, is crying, you could use this and sort of create different versions of your face and sort of have them all morph together. The only thing to keep in mind is that you don't change sort of the underlying geometry. So if you do, a crazy new sort of morph, or a crazy new sort of movement, or add more geometry to your object, then this method wouldn't actually work that well. Now this is the long way of doing this. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch back to the sculpting layout, and I'm going to hide this new bug that I made here. And I'm going to bring back my original sort of, actually, was it this one? Nope. This one? Nope. So I'll repeat the process here. So I'm just going to select this here and hit C to make this editable again. All right, so now we're back to our mesh here. So I'm going to make this into a sculpt object again. So I'm going to come over here and add a subdivide. So now if I go into my sculpting layers, I'm going to double tap this tab. So now I have one sculpt layer here. So now I'm going to use the same tools here for grabbing, but I'm going to show you how to do this in a more automated way. So again, and this doesn't just apply to the grab tool. I could do this with the draw tool. I could do this with, anything I wanted to do. Maybe here, let's do this. Maybe we'll have our face be drawn on. That's what we'll do on this one. So what I'm going to do here is I have my base object here. What I'm going to actually do is I'm going to come down here to the bottom of my menu here, and I'm actually going to add a layer. So just like we were working with layers while doing our body paint, sculpting also has layers that we can use as well. And on this one here, I'm going to draw my face on. So I have my original base sort of mesh here, which has nothing on it. And then I have layer 1, which we'll name this face. And now I'm going to draw my face here. So I'm going to draw my eyes. I'm going to draw my nose. Maybe I'll smooth this out a bit. And then I'm going to draw my smile here. Perfect. So now I have this, little face on top of my character here. So now what I'm going to do is, instead of having to go through the whole process of, making a new one, connecting it together, using the pose morph in the more manual way, I'm just going to come down here to my menu where it says sculpt to pose morph, and this is going to automatically do the process that I was doing before. So you'll see that it did a little bit of a jump, which you might not have caught. But if I go into my object manager now, you'll see that I have multiple, I have a new mesh here that actually has my pose morph already built onto it. So now if I hide my original mesh here, double tap into my pose morph, and I go to my animate tab, I already have a slider here, and this slider will automatically create the face with the new mesh that I have. So it automatically created a new morph pose for my new geometry here. And I can, animate this just as well as I did the other one. So if I come up to my startup layout, go to frame 1, create a keyframe for the slider, go to frame 30, create a keyframe down here. And if I hit play now, you see that now I have this face that is being pushed out of my face here, or out of my base sort of mesh here. So just like that, we created a little bit of animation on our character using the sculpting tools. Now, it doesn't have to be this sort of method. It could be, maybe you want, just the mouth to draw on, or maybe you want to actually manipulate the whole head so that it's in a different rotation or something like that. There's really, it's up to you what you want to do in terms of your animation and sort of morphing it. But yeah, those are really quickly two ways that you can go about sort of manipulating your mesh using the pose morph. Now, the last one that I want to show here, and then I think I might give you all some chance to actually do this on your own before I break down my final project, is just sort of how to animate with the sculpting by itself. So I'm going to save my project here, and I'm going to hide this. I'm going to go back to my sculpt that I had. So let me clear out my scene a little bit here. All right, here we go. So we are back to our sculpt here. So let's say, you don't want to do the whole break apart thing. You just want to leave this sort of as the sculpt is, and who knows, maybe you want to come over here and you might want to change something later on. Which is totally fine. So of course we can use different effects inside of Cinema 4D to manipulate our sort of objects. So a lot of you have worked with these, but if not, there are a bunch of different sort of deformers and effectors that you can use in order to manipulate your mesh. So let's say I wanted this head to sort of, twist around a little bit. I could add a twist deformer in our scene, which becomes this huge sort of box here, and you can resize this box to your own personal liking. But the main thing is you want to make sure that this is below your mesh. Now, if we put this on here, by default, you'll see that this doesn't actually do anything because we have this sculpting tag on it. What we need to actually do is we need to freeze our sculpt and sort of allow deformations. So you can do this by making sure that the sculpt is selected. You don't need to double tap it, just one tap, and coming down here to our attributes and enabling the freeze option and the deformation option. Once you do that, depending on how strong of a twist you have, you'll notice that your object can now be deformed. So now I can sort of twist our face here in any sort of way, and of course, just like anything else inside of Cinema 4D, we can animate this if we want to. So if I wanted to sort of, animate this going back and forth, that's something that we could do. Or maybe we don't like that it's covering the whole face. Maybe we want to do it just on sort of the bottom part of our character here. Maybe we could do something just sort of like that. So it's really up to you how you want to use this sort of technique. But the key thing to keep in mind is that you need to make sure that your sculpt tag has the freeze option selected and that allow deformations is enabled. Of course, if you want to go back to manipulating it, you can just sort of uncheck these, and then you can go back to manipulating this in any sort of way that you see fit. So that's how you would add some deformations to your animation. So since that was pretty quick there, I think what I'm going to give everyone a chance to do is just to try to sort of see if you can sort of animate or sort of manipulate your mesh using either two of these methods. So either using a defector, so either using a deformer and freezing your sculpt, or trying to go with one of the two sort of pose morph methods. These are a bit more involved, so if you don't get it quite up front, that's totally cool. Just take your time and work with it, and of course feel free to ask any questions. I think I'm going to give everyone, based on the time that we have, about sort of 20 minutes to work on that. just to sort of give you some in-class time to actually manipulate your geometry, and just to see sort of what you can come up with. Again, the animating part is sort of, an add-on for this assignment, but being able to use the volume builder, which is in the standard layout right up here at the top, or you can go to volume and add different elements to your geometry. That can actually be quite handy to have. So just two other methods for you to work around with. So I'm going to give everyone 20 minutes to sort of work on that. And if you do come up with anything cool, that's what I'm going to ask you to submit in about 20 minutes. If you do an animation, you can sort of render out an MP4. If you do just sort of a still manipulation of what you currently have, you can just submit your JPEG or your PNG, and then we can take a look at that.